Long before Europe shaped the Cinderella we know today, there was a real girl whose life was painful, complex, and entirely human. Her story did not involve pumpkins, magic, or glass slippers. It came from dusty historical fragments, ancient writings, and scholars who traced the earliest known version recorded in China more than 1,000 years ago. Her name was Yi Xian. She lived during the Tang dynasty around the 9th century, in a remote tribal region far from the imperial cities. Her father, the chief of the Yu community, was respected for wisdom and fairness. Historical notes and surviving folktales describe him as a quiet, thoughtful leader who valued peaceful governance. Yi Xian's mother died not long after giving birth, and the girl grew up under the care of her father and the loyal women of the household. From early accounts, she was gifted with unusual intelligence and a gentle, calm nature. She learned to weave, fish, and carve delicate ornaments from shells found along the riverbanks. People remembered her for her kindness and the silent dignity that made even strangers soften their voices around her. When Yi Xian was still young, her father died of an illness that spread through the region. After his death, control of the household passed to one of his wives, a woman described by later storytellers as severe, shrewd, and quick to anger. Her name was Jun Li, and she brought with her a daughter of her own. Once she gained control, she dismissed the loyal attendants who had cared for Yi Xian, and replaced them with women loyal only to herself. With no one left to defend her, Yi Xian was pushed into the status of a servant within her own home. Historical interpretation suggests that rivalry and inheritance were the real cause of the cruelty. In their society, daughters of different wives could create dangerous tensions, especially when wealth and leadership were at stake. Yi Xian, being the biological daughter of the chief's first and most honored wife, posed a threat. If she gained support and connections, she might claim inherited authority. And so her stepmother acted not out of aimless hatred, but out of fear and ambition. Yi Xian's daily life changed completely. She was ordered to perform the heaviest labor: hauling water, gathering firewood, cleaning, preparing food, washing clothes in icy rivers. Her hands cracked from the cold. Her clothes were thin and rough. She slept near the hearth to stay warm, where soot clung to her skin and clothes. In some retellings, villagers mentioned that whenever they met her at the river, she looked so exhausted that she could barely lift her head to greet them. Despite the weight of her circumstances, the girl carried a quiet resilience. She often worked near the streams where she had once played as a child. She found companionship in the natural world, particularly in a bright, unusually gentle fish that lived near the riverbank. Scholars believe this detail was no fantasy. In many rural communities of southern China, keeping a particular animal near a home or river as a companion or symbol of fortune was common. Villagers who later repeated her story said the fish grew large and followed her whenever she approached the water. In a life where every human voice around her was harsh, the presence of the animal became a form of comfort. Her stepmother discovered this bond and saw it as a threat. Any small piece of joy that Yi Xian found was immediately taken from her. According to early accounts, the fish was caught and killed during a communal meal. The story is tragic but grounded in the real practices of the time. Food was scarce, and a large river fish would never be wasted. When Yi Xian learned what had happened, witnesses described her collapse by the riverbank, the first time anyone had seen her break down in public. Life continued like this for years. Yi Xian grew into adulthood under constant surveillance, with no freedom, no companions, and no chance at marriage because her stepmother refused to allow suitors near her. In many historical societies, a young woman's marriage was arranged not for her happiness, but for alliances, wealth, and power. Jun Li wanted every possible advantage for her own daughter. Yi Xian's intelligence, beauty, and reputation for kindness made her a potential rival, so she was hidden away as much as possible. The turning point came when the tribe organized an annual festival. This event was real and historically documented, an early form of a community gathering where young men and women met for possible marriage arrangements. Families dressed their daughters in their finest clothing and jewelry. Dancing, music, and lantern light were part of the night. It was the one opportunity where social boundaries loosened, and people could choose companions outside their usual circles. Yi Xian was absolutely forbidden from attending. Her stepmother dressed her own daughter in fine silks, prepared lavish ornaments, and traveled with her to the festival. Yi Xian was left behind to complete long lists of chores. Yet the stir of celebration, the sound of drums echoing across the hills, and the knowledge that all the young people of the region were gathering stirred something inside her. Memories of her parents' warmth and her lost childhood returned like a tide. For the first time in years, she felt a longing not merely to survive, but to live. Later records say she found clothing left behind by her mother. They were not magical, not shimmering, not transformed by anything mystical. They were simply the best garments her mother had owned. Delicate embroidered cloth, carefully preserved but forgotten. Yixian cleaned them, repaired the torn edges, and dressed herself with trembling hands. Scholars believe the shoes that appear in the earliest versions, tiny, light, and beautiful, were not glass. They were most likely made of polished fish scales or kingfisher feathers, which were common luxury materials of the time. They glimmered faintly in lantern light, and that was enough to become legendary. With nothing but her courage, wearing the garments of the woman who had loved her most, Yixian walked toward the festival. Every step was a risk. If her stepmother recognized her, the consequences could be severe. But something stronger than fear carried her forward. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps hope. Perhaps the simple belief that she deserved one night where she was not a servant. The closer Yixian came to the festival grounds, the louder the world became. Lanterns hung from tree branches like floating embers. Drums thudded in steady rhythms that echoed across the hillside. The scent of roasted chestnuts, steamed dumplings, and incense smoke drifted through the night air. Men and women from every nearby settlement gathered in bright clothing, laughing, singing, and greeting relatives they had not seen in months. It was the first time in years that Yixian witnessed such a gathering, and for a moment she stood completely still. Overwhelmed by the unfamiliar brightness, she walked into the crowd, keeping her head down, hoping her stepmother and stepsister were surrounded by enough people that they wouldn't notice her. The embroidered clothing she wore drew glances from others, not because it was the finest, but because it carried an elegance that stood out from the festival's usual attire. Some people whispered, trying to guess who she might be. No one recognized her as the servant girl who gathered water each morning. Years of exhaustion had changed her, but so had determination. On this night, she carried herself as the daughter of a chief once again. Young men approached her, offering cups of warm rice wine or asking her to join the circle dance. She refused politely, still shaken by the risk she was taking. She stayed near the lantern-lit edge of the gathering, where she could watch without being seen easily. Yet even there, her presence created small ripples in the social tide around her. People moved aside, glanced twice, tried to find her companion. To them she seemed like someone important, someone belonging to a family of status. The chief of a neighboring tribe noticed her too. Historical interpretations suggest that he was a man in his late 20s, unmarried, respected, known for fairness, and deeply responsible for his community. He saw Yixian standing alone beneath the lanterns, her face calm but distant. He approached her with the respectful confidence of a leader, and asked if she was enjoying the celebration. She answered gently, offering few words, but enough to show her intelligence and humility. The chief was drawn in immediately. Witnesses later recalled that he stayed near her for a long time, speaking about the festival, the changing seasons, and the challenges of leading a tribe. They said Yixian listened quietly, offering brief answers, her voice soft but steady. It was an entirely human moment, nothing dramatic or theatrical, just two people discovering a small connection in a large crowd. But the night could not protect her forever. Her stepmother and stepsister arrived at the center of the gathering accompanied by their attendants. They were eager for attention and displayed themselves proudly, hoping to draw the eyes of the most eligible men. The stepmother's gaze swept over the crowd again and again, looking for threats or rivals. It was only a matter of time before she noticed the girl standing beneath the lanterns, the girl speaking with the chief even from a distance. Something about the figure unsettled her. She could not identify the face, but the posture, the presence, the quiet grace. These reminded her of someone she hated seeing grow stronger. She moved closer, pushing through the crowd with her daughter. Yixian noticed them too late. Panic surged through her hard-earned composure. She stepped away from the chief so suddenly that he called after her, unsure why she was leaving. She fled into the shadows beyond the lanterns, her heart pounding. In her haste, one of her finely crafted shoes slipped from her foot and fell onto the path. People saw her run, but no one followed, thinking she merely wished to remain unseen in the crowd. It was only the chief who noticed the shoe left behind. He picked it up and stared at it, Unsure why she had disappeared so abruptly, Yixian made her way back home with only one shoe, breath shaking, terrified that her stepmother would arrive before she could hide the evidence. She returned to her corner of the hearth and changed out of her mother's garments as quickly as she could. The festival sounds echoed faintly through the hills while she tried to steady her breathing. Meanwhile, her stepmother stormed back home much later, convinced she had seen a girl wearing garments far too familiar. But she had no proof, and Yixian appeared in her usual soot-covered clothing when confronted. The stepmother left it alone, but the suspicion settled inside her like a seed across the region. The chief of the neighboring tribe kept the lost shoe. For days he thought about the young woman who had vanished without explanation. In their culture, it was common for people to identify others through unique clothing, ornaments, and family symbols. A beautifully crafted shoe made of rare materials was not just footwear. It was a sign of lineage and identity. He took it to the elders and showed it to them, hoping they might recognize the craftsmanship. The elders, impressed by the shoe's elegance and its connection to known artisans of the region, believed that the girl who wore such a piece must belong to a noble or high-status household. They encouraged the chief to search for her, not through magical means, but through reasonable inquiries. In a society where community ties were strong and travel was limited, it was entirely possible to trace someone through distinctive objects, so he began a quiet search, visiting nearby households and asking if any young woman had lost such an ornament at the festival. Most people admired the shoe but denied any connection to it. Some claimed it must belong to a wealthy family from beyond the hills. A few suggested that no girl in their region could own such a thing. At last, he came to the household of Yixian's stepmother. She greeted him with rigid politeness, taken off guard by his presence. When he asked if a young woman in her home had attended the festival, she insisted that only her own daughter had gone, and that her family suffered no losses. She even offered to bring her daughter forward. The stepsister appeared in heavy embroidered silks but clearly did not resemble the girl the chief had spoken to. Yet something about the house felt wrong. The chief, trained to read body language and subtle shifts of tone, noticed the stepmother's unease. The household seemed tense, as if fear lingered in the corners. He thanked them and left, but suspicion followed him. Back at home, Yixian tried to continue her harsh routine, but something inside her had changed. She had tasted a few hours of freedom. She had seen how people treated her when she was no longer disguised by labor and ash. And she had spoken to a man who valued her words, even though he did not know her name. This moment planted a quiet strength in her, one that would soon force her stepmother's world to unravel. In the weeks that followed the festival, quiet ripples spread across the region. People spoke of the mysterious young woman with the calm face and the finely crafted shoe. Not a legend, not a fantasy, but a real girl who had appeared briefly and disappeared just as quickly. Some believed she came from a distant noble family. Some believed she had already left the area. Only a few suspected she lived closer than anyone imagined. The chief could not forget their brief conversation. He remembered the softness of her answers, the slight tremor in her voice, and the way she looked at the lanterns as if she had not seen light in years. The shoe rested on a wooden stand in his home, a reminder of the moment that had slipped away from him. Each day he felt more certain that her disappearance had not been her choice. He returned to the villages, but this time he observed more than he asked. He watched how people lived, how families behaved, how daughters were treated. It was during one of these visits that he heard something that made him pause. A group of women at the river were speaking in lowered voices about a young girl in a nearby household who worked harder than any servant, who slept by the hearth, who rarely spoke, and who never joined the other girls at gatherings. They did not know her name, they only knew her suffering. The chief listened without interrupting. When they finished, he thanked them and walked away, his suspicion now sharper than before. Back at Yixian's household, life had grown more suffocating. Her stepmother's suspicion from the night of the festival had not faded. She watched Yixian more closely, assigned her more tasks, and spoke to her with colder restraint than ever. Yixian endured, but something inside her had changed. The memory of standing beneath the lanterns refused to leave her. It reminded her of who she used to be. It reminded her that she once belonged to a family of honor. It reminded her she was not meant to spend her life bending beneath cruelty. One evening, as she scrubbed clay pots near the back wall, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Heavy, steady, deliberate. She didn't look up. She never expected visitors for herself. She expected only more orders, but the stepmother heard the hoofbeats too, and for a brief moment she panicked. When she stepped outside and saw the chief of the neighboring tribe dismount, she straightened her stance, her expression tightening into polite surprise. She greeted him with the sweetened tone she used only for people she needed on her side. He accepted her greeting with distant courtesy. His eyes scanned the courtyard. He noticed the soot near the door. He noticed the faint scrape marks from heavy buckets. He noticed the silence of a house that should have been lively. And then he saw Yisian. She stood near the steps, her clothes patched and rough, her hair tied back, her posture stiff from work. The moment their eyes met, both froze. He recognized her instantly. Not from her clothing, not from her shoes, but from the calm sadness in her gaze. She looked away quickly, afraid of what would happen if her stepmother noticed, but the chief stepped forward. He asked her gently if she had attended the festival. The stepmother stepped between them immediately, insisting that the girl was a servant, barely educated, incapable of attending such an event. The chief did not argue. He simply held out the shoe. The silence that followed felt long enough to span years. Yi Xian did not move. She did not reach for it. She only stared at the small piece of her mother's memory, shining softly in the sunlight. Her stepmother attempted to laugh, claiming the girl had never owned anything of value, but her voice trembled. In that trembling, the truth revealed itself. The chief saw everything he needed to see. He turned to Yi Xian and asked one more time. Her hand shook as she stepped forward. Not because the shoe represented chance, but because it represented the life she had lost. Slowly, she lifted her foot and placed it inside the delicate ornament that it fit perfectly. Her stepmother's face hardened, her lies collapsing around her. The chief looked at Yi Xian not with triumph, but with heartbreak that someone with such gentleness had been living under such cruelty for so long. He offered her safety, he offered her dignity, not with promises of royalty or dreams of fantasy, but with the simple truth that she deserved better than this. Yi Xian did not answer immediately. She looked at the home where she had suffered. She looked at the place where her mother's belongings were hidden away. She looked at the woman who had turned her into a shadow, and then she stepped forward. The chief brought her into his household, not as a rescued princess, but as a woman reclaiming her identity. Over time she was trained in the responsibilities of leadership. People in the region came to respect her quiet intelligence. She was known for her fairness, for her ability to listen, and for her empathy toward those who worked hardest and spoke least. Because she had once lived their life, her stepmother and stepsister continued their lives, but without the advantage they once held. Deprived of the power they had stolen, they faded into the background of local memory. Some versions say they left the region. Others say they remained, living with the consequences of their own cruelty. But Yi Xian's story did not fade. It traveled from village to village, from region to region. Eventually it was written down during the 9th century and became one of the earliest recorded versions of what the world would later call Cinderella. Over the centuries, other cultures reshaped it, added magic, removed tragedy, polished it into a tale meant for children rather than a story about real suffering and resilience. But at its core, Yi Xian's story was not about fairy godmothers or shimmering magic. It was about a girl who endured harshness with dignity, a girl who found courage when the world gave her none, a girl who stepped out of the shadows not by enchantment, but by her own quiet strength. Her story survived for more than 1,000 years because people recognized truth in it, the kind of truth that lives in every society, in every era, in every home where cruelty and hope live side by side. And so the real Cinderella was not a figure made of glass and fantasy. She was a real young woman who rose from hardship, not through magic, but through resilience, intelligence, and a single night where she dared to believe she deserved more than what life had given her.